Hello, this is Kyle, rambling in a closet. Thank you for listening. I was just listening to another podcast, and he was talking about this letter that was in some kind of news article, story place thing, and it was about how it was written from, I think, an older lady who was lamenting the fact that she would never have grandkids because her kids all either didn't get married or chose to not have kids up until now, or as far as up until now. And so she doesn't see, they've all chosen to not have kids, and so she doesn't see the future of having any grandkids. And basically the story was, it was like an op-ed or something, and it was explaining why this makes her so sad. And the person on the podcast was giving his take, and his take was more along the lines of, yeah, that is sad. It does kind of suck when you realize that bringing life into this world is really what gives it most meaning. And then when you've done your own part as far as bringing life into the world, yeah, it is kind of nice to see the life that you brought in bring in more life. I imagine. I mean, I don't know. I have not gotten to that point yet, but I imagine that would be pretty cool. Talk about creating something. And so, yeah, I can imagine there'd be some kind of pain in our, biology that would make us go, oh, man, that kind of stinks, And so this guy's take was more along the lines of, yeah, this does suck, it is sad, and yes, we should be having kids. And it is, it's more of a pro what the op-ed was about and against what a lot of people, there was a few people who came out in a reply against the op-ed. And they were saying along the lines of, there were a few of them. There were many, but a few that kind of stand out. And they said something along the lines of, yeah, we did decide to not have kids. I mean, we made that decision. It is our own life, and it is kind of selfish and invasive when my parents and other relatives press upon me their desire for us to have kids. It's like, we want to live our own life. We don't want to bring any kids into this world right now. We don't feel as if we're ready. We don't think that that's something that we want to do. Now, and they were more along the lines of that. And, my general opinion is kind of somewhere in the middle. I'm very understanding of both sides because I had a lot of friends growing up. And now, obviously, we were young, and a lot of us have probably changed our minds, and maybe some of us or a lot of us haven't. But a lot of people were saying stuff like, yeah, no, I never want to be a parent. My parents, they messed up so badly. I never want to do to them what they did to me, kind of thing. And I've had friends that were girls also, lament the fact or say something that is about how their family is always kind of pushing them to have kids. Now, I've heard one of these instances happen where a family member was, playfully joking about their daughter having kids, and it was playful, and she took it as such as well. So it was a good interaction. But I can see both things happen. I know that there are family members. I've met them. I've seen them. Not mine, but I've seen people who definitely add that pressure to their younger generation to create an even younger generation. And that's fine, I understand, but there can be inappropriate ways to do so. Whereas you can do it playfully. But I can see how some people might misinterpret a playful attempt to, hey, you should have more kids, rather than an invasive one. But I know of both circumstances happening, which is why I can empathize a little bit with the con to this op-ed, which is that, no, I actually don't like that my family is pressuring me in this way. It's very inappropriate. It's very invasive. I want to live my life my own way. And I can totally understand that. And I totally understand the fact that, this is kind of where I want to get into. By the way, I'll give my opinion real quick before I get into the main theme of this episode. My general opinion is, yeah, you probably should have kids. I think that's literally one of maybe the 2 or 3 reasons why we even exist on this world, is to create more of us. I mean, even if you take away, I'm pretty sure I've said this before, but I imagine, it's just from a logical standpoint, if you take away the possibility of the existence of God, and you say that we're just animals with chemical reactions, then what do animals do? They survive and they reproduce. That's all they do. They survive and reproduce, and they just create more of themselves and survive and make more and survive and make more. So that's what we do as animals, as creatures. Everything down to a cell, all the way up to, a blue whale. They just make more. We just make more of us. So if you remove religion and just think of us as a purely, logical, no need for a higher power to explain things, then yeah, it's make more and survive. But then also from a religious standpoint, I can't imagine any religions that don't, but I imagine most religions do kind of, give the thumbs up to, yeah, you should have more kids. It's built within us. And so, that makes sense that literally the best thing you can do in your life, barring exceptions, there are certain individuals who everybody can agree, yeah, it's probably good that you don't have kids for the safety of the kids and for the betterment of yourself as well. But I believe those are the minimal. They have to be in the minority, or else a species would never grow, right? So, of course, there are people who probably are best to not have kids, but they are very, very, very few and far between. The majority of people are probably able to and should and get better at, but are mostly able to have kids and raise them and rear them. But if you look at where I really want to get into is, I had a conversation with a grandmother before, I believe, and it was along the lines of the kids of nowadays, the millennials, the Gen Zers, whatever. They don't have as much of a work ethic as previous generations. It kind of was along the lines of, the most recent generation sucks kind of thing, but it wasn't that harsh, obviously. I mean, she's a very empathetic person. She's very much full of love and kindness, but she was definitely saying, yeah, it does seem that there is a lack of desire to go out there into the world and build something from the younger generations. And I said, yeah, I agree. And somehow we got to the point where she said, and that's unfortunate, these kids should really get onto it. And I'm like, well, yeah, I get that, but honestly, we should probably hold their parents accountable to some extent, right? Because their parents didn't really, obviously, give them a big enough toolbox to do all these things that older generations had done. Maybe older generations' parents were much better. And she responded, I don't know, I think it's more about the society. It's more, she didn't say this, but basically what she was saying is it's more nature rather than nurture. It depends on more of who you're around, where you're around, the environment you're in, rather than who your parents are. And I had to disagree with her. I do think it's, if not 50-50, it's definitely more, it's definitely 60-40, 70-30, the majority on the side of nurture. I think there's a lot that goes into the parenting style and what goes on during that. Obviously, nurture matters, if you're fed properly. But then again, if you have good parents, even if you're not can't afford all the good organic stuff, you can still put mostly healthy food in front of your child. You don't have to do McDonald's and stuff. You can do, I don't know, whatever my parents did. I ended up turning out okay, and I wasn't given, we didn't eat health food, but we also didn't eat McDonald's every day. So we had a nice little middle ground, I think. So, yeah, I think the more of it goes actually into nurture. And by the way, even if it is true that it's more about nature, well, the environment in which we live is made up of older generations, or the generation that is your parents. So the society we live in is still not doing a good enough job rearing us. And what's happening, I think, what I've seen in my friends, in just culture as much as I can pick up from my few years on this earth, is that the kids who are not given the toolbox don't want to have more kids because, it probably scares the death out of them, scares the life out of them. It probably scares them to death. There we go. B, they probably really have not been instilled with the belief that giving yourself onto others is better than giving yourself to yourself. And so they just don't want to have kids because they're like, that's going to take away from my life. That's going to stop me from my career. It's going to stop me from doing this. It's going to stop me from doing that. It's going to cost money. It's going to be responsibility. I don't really like those answers as much, even though I've heard them. I don't think that's a very good one. I think, but we don't have to get to that point. Obviously, there's logic to it, right? But I think it mostly comes from the fact that they were not instilled with the feeling of responsibility, the desire to create that, which is life, which is the most advanced thing that has ever been created, right? Or made. You know what I mean? But they also weren't given the tools to do that. They weren't shown how to do it. Like, I'm not going to lie. I have great parents, okay? Never once have I talked to them about what it would be like to have a kid. It's just, it never comes up. Because, why would you talk about it until you... Like I said, I'm not saying this is a negative aspect of my parents. The conversations just never come up. Plus, the internet's out there, so I could, of course, ask them what they did. And I can also go look at the internet if that time ever comes, if my wife and I ever do create a little us. But I think the toolbox that's missing, that I think to some extent I am lucky enough to have because of my parents and because of the way I was raised and where I grew up, I believe I was given enough of a toolbox to get to this point and to keep going. And I want kids, and so does my wife, and it's going to happen soon, and we're very excited about it. And, that's something we want. We're of course a little scared, of the idea, but we still want it. We're not scared to death of it. Whereas I think, and it's as simple as, imagine if you don't know, really, if you don't know how to perform an oil change, you don't want to do an oil change. If no one ever taught you how to change the oil on your car, you're never going to you're not just going to sit down and go, well, you know what, I guess I'm just going to figure it out, and having a kid, I imagine, is significantly more complicated than doing an oil change. There's a lot more to know, and therefore, if you don't know all of that, you're going to be less likely to want to do it. And if you were, on another reason, if you were given a lot of bad examples of parenting growing up, which I believe happened in the last few generations, I believe there is a massive failure from parents. Just based on what I've seen, based on where we are as a society, there's been some massive failures coming on down from the boomers and on, I think. And, what do I know? I have not, I like to think I'm a pretty observant guy. I've spent, the past 8 years learning about stuff. I'm not saying I'm a genius, but I'm also not saying that I don't know anything. I think I know enough to say that there has been some failures in our society as far as when it comes to passing down the torch, the parental failures. Now, I hate saying stuff like this. I don't want to keep saying, oh, well, I'm not a parent, so obviously this is just my opinion. You all know by now, this is just my opinion and I'm just talking. I don't want to keep prefacing everything with, I don't mean this 100%. It's okay. I could be wrong. Because, of course, I could be wrong about everything, but I just want to talk, so I'm just going to talk. So I'm going to stop saying stuff like that, at least for this episode. I'm sure it'll come back in at some point. Yeah, I think there's been some massive failures from the passing it down the torch aspect of society. And, you see it a lot in... I have so many friends who, there's a lot of memes on X, and they'll post them and they'll like... I don't follow any... I don't have really any friends on X now. It's mostly just my news source. But when I had a Facebook with all my friends and they would share stuff and post things, there is a large consensus, it seems, that adulting is very hard and very scary and very daunting and should be celebrated. And all these guys, 18 to early 20s to mid 20s, they were posting this kind of stuff. And what they mean by adulting is paying some bills, doing the laundry, and cooking for yourself. And they're probably failing at all of that to some extent because they think it's so hard. And I find that that's a bummer, because to me, I'm not saying paying bills is any fun, but it's not hard as long as you're making money. Probably best that you don't procure any bills that you can't afford in the first place, but hey, whatever. As long as you're working, you can pay them off. It's great. Cooking for yourself, I actually enjoy cooking, and doing the laundry, is annoying. And I wait until the last possible minute to do the laundry. Yeah, but I don't want to get on some rant about, how the kids are so weak nowadays, because the whole point I'm trying to make actually is I really don't think parents... This isn't completely my opinion, as in I didn't just come up with it, but this is my opinion based on things I've heard over the past 8 years and things based on things I've experienced throughout my entire life and just general observations. It seems like what happened is the greatest generation came back from World War II and the Great Depression and everything, and they had kids, and there was some economic upward rises, and they just kind of wanted to give their kids everything they could because they had some rough times, a Great Depression and World War II back to back. Oh, and before that, World War I. So you have 2 or 3 generations of just, wow, things sucked. So they wanted to really, and there was a silent generation, and then there were the boomers, which were really what happened, what came from the massive economic upward boom and the fact that a lot of people were just so happy to have survived the first half century. And I think what happed is what happens, it's generational loss. I've noticed this is why, in AFJ ROTC, my goodness, the little Reserve Officer Training Corps for kids in high school, you make these things called continuity folders, so that when you take, I was the equipment guy. I ran, I forget what it was called, but I ran the it's like quartermaster basically, but whatever their version was, and I ran their office full of stuff, and there was a continuity folder showing what I would do down to the detail in that job. And I really liked continuity folders because it left nothing gray. If you had a question about what your job entailed and what it is you do and what kind of responsibilities you had, you would see the continuity folder. And if for whatever reason there was not something in there, you would go and add to it and create for yourself and the next person a continuity folder. It was made so that there was no generational loss, so that each person handing them the torch would keep on doing the job that was done previously. But what I see happening, especially in jobs that I have, and when I train people too, like for example, when I'm training someone to be a server, I don't necessarily pass on every single bit of information in my head because that's a lot. You get the basics, you get what you can out there, and then you kind of let them fend for themselves and figure it out, which is fine. That's what they did to me. I learned most of my stuff through, on the job training and just experience figuring everything out. So that's fine. But wouldn't it be nicer if I took all of that, could somehow condense it into a palatable source of information and then pass it on to the next server and they could just kind of integrate that into themselves? Yeah, that'd be great. And I think what happened, and by the way, if you think about that, I train someone who does a job to a lesser extent than what I could do because I couldn't pass down all the knowledge. And then before they have a chance to get up to my knowledge level, they're training someone else. And so you have this slow degeneration of the known information. And it might be more extreme for some jobs and some generational, movings, and it might be less for others, There's only so much you can really train someone to do as far as serving. But imagine if you're like a car mechanic and think about it. You're a car mechanic and you train this guy how to do all the basics, but you've never had to replace a certain part of the car, so it just never comes up. You never really show it to the person you're training. And then, you retire. The person who's working on it finally has that problem come to him, and he's like, oh, shoot, I don't know how to do this. I've never been told how to do this. So obviously he'll go and figure it out, I guess, maybe, or just say, sorry, we can't do this. But YouTube does a lot nowadays. But you get what I'm saying. You understand what I'm trying to say. There is this potential loss in generation after generation of information. And I think that's what's going on a lot, just as far as being a human being goes from one generation to the next. I think what happened is the greatest generation and the silent generation, back to back, they were just so stoked to have been survived that they just had kids and tried to give their kids, I wasn't there, I don't know, but this is just the vibe I get, right? So just let me know what you think. And while these boomers' kids' childhoods probably weren't the easiest, I'm not saying they had it great, but they also were, they lived in America. And there were, I believe there was an economic boom during and after World War II, and then in the late 60s, but don't quote me on that, because I don't know about that late 60s part. But yeah, they did pretty well, I think. And I think they were the greatest the older generations were just so stoked to give their kids a better life that they kind of forgot some things to pass down. And then that happened again with the boomers to my parents' generation, Gen X. And then it happened again to my generation, the millennial generation, and then Gen Zs. And I think what happened is basically we just kind of forgot what to pass down. Because we live in this society, we live in this great culture, this great society of freedom and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And so because we've had it our entire lives and for the past, 4, 5, 6 generations, we don't feel like we need to tell our kids, hey, by the way, you have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and here's what that means. You don't have to tell them that because, it's just life. You don't have to explain life. You don't have to explain what a tree is every time you see a tree. It's just a tree. You kind of, if you don't, you know what I mean? If you talk about it, if you don't talk about it, you'll figure it out in the end. Oh, it's a tree. We are so saturated by success and by a healthy, decreasingly so, but a healthy culture that we didn't pass it on. And this is where that loop comes. I think this is where a loop comes from, that being good men make good times make weak men make bad times, and bad times make good men. That's probably where another source of that cycle comes from, which is the generational loss of information. And I think what's happened here is the generations above us didn't really do a good job on passing down the tools to be parents. And that's why, while I understand what this, going back to the beginning, while I understand what this specific lady is saying by she's sad that she won't be a grandchild, I also wonder, if she passed down the proper knowledge so that her children would not only want to, but would do it and be parents and give her a grandchild. I don't think I owe my parents anything, but at the same time I do, because they gave me life. I'm here because of them. And while that wasn't my choice, I'm not one of those cynical, butt nuggets that says, "Oh, well, I didn't choose to get born, so I was brought into life against my will." And yeah, I'm using a mocking voice on purpose because I think that's a very silly thing to say. Don't get me wrong, if your life is absolutely brutal and sucks terribly, that's terrible. We should fix that. But for the most part, especially in this country, especially in the majority, if you're brought into this world, you're doing okay. You're like the top 1% of the entire history. You're the top 0.001% of the entire history of humanity. You're doing okay. And while, yes, it makes sense that you don't necessarily owe anybody anything because you didn't really have a choice in it, at the same time, you kind of do. You kind of do owe your society something. You kind of do owe your parents something. You kind of do, especially if your family did a good job, moderately speaking. If they did anywhere north of positive of a job of parenting you, yeah, you kind of do owe them, actually. And at the same time, your parents, if you're a parent, you probably shouldn't be nagging and being invasive on your child for telling them what to do with their life. Two things can be true at once. It is okay to want and expect grandchildren. It's not okay to try to control and invade your child's life. And another two things that can be true at the same time. It is perfectly acceptable to not feel as if you owe anyone anything with your life and you should live it the way you want to. And also at the same time, it's okay to have that be the case and to feel as if you do owe. And, it's probably best if you do pay your debts in some way. And plus, I'm the kind of person who believes that giving yourself to something bigger than yourself makes you a happier person than just doing whatever you want and being selfish and hedonistic. Like my life has gotten infinitely better after deciding that the union between my wife and I is significantly more important than myself. I don't matter. And hopefully, I will actually think this way when it happens, and I think I will. But when I become a parent, I imagine that my life will get even more frightening and scary and hard, but also even more joyful and meaningful when I decide that, wow, my life really doesn't matter. It's all about this kid/kids. Still trying to get her up to +4 kids, but that's okay. It's all right, and that's why a story like this, it kind of pulls me both ways. And that's why, the podcast I was listening to, the guy who was talking, I really like him. I really enjoy his take on things. But I think he took that kind of uber conservative point of view towards it, which is, yeah, you silly kids should be having more kids. Stop being selfish. And it's like, yeah, I guess, maybe. But also, I think there's something to be said about the failure of our older generations in passing down that toolbox. And passing down that desire and that need for response, or that feeling of responsibility that you do in fact owe your country, you owe your civilization something, And hey, if you're a super uber productive individual and you bring about millions of jobs or whatever, maybe you don't need to have a kid. You're doing your own. You're doing great, I think, for a culture. That's fine. I understand that. I'm not gonna say anybody needs to or should have a kid because I don't know, but I think generally speaking, it's a safe thing to say. I do. I think it's a safe thing to say that most people should make more people. But it does suck. It does kind of suck that this is almost political because the podcaster, is a political podcast. He's a political pundit. And this is it has political overtones for some reason. You can kind of tell who's going to think what when it comes to this. I think most conservatives, most Republicans would say what this guy is saying. You need to have kids. And I think most liberals, progressive Democrats would probably say, people don't need to do anything. They don't owe them. This grandma or wannabe grandma should not feel this way. She should not put this feeling on our kids. It's not a kid's responsibility for their parents to be happy, after all. I think that's a safe thing to say, right? And I, like I said, I empathize with both points of view, which is why I see myself as mostly politically homeless, because I can empathize with a lot of with a lot of opinions that the political spectrum shares, other than the crazy extreme ones, which I don't ever think I'm really going to get into, because those are extreme and they can be polarizing. Whereas I'd rather talk about something that can bring us all together, and that we can talk about and go, yeah, I never thought about it like that. I guess we can agree in that sort of way. And what I hope is that you listening, don't think anything like, oh, of course he would say that, or, oh gosh, that he's just saying that because. I think I've said something that makes sense, because mostly it's agreeing with both sides, so it's hard to disagree with that, I guess. But the way I feel about this is the way I feel about a lot of things, which is that there is this really lovely middle ground, and it also leads the way to an interesting discussion. I would love to talk to somebody like that grandma that I talked to, and anybody else in the past few generations, about that idea that, hey, maybe there has been some generational information loss, and there has been some failures of the parents of the last few generations. I think that's perfectly fine. And it's not an insult either. I don't see it as an insult. I don't see it as, oh, you failed, you suck. I think it was generally a mistake, and I think it's just the sign of our times. It's what happens when you live in such a great era. I don't want to blame anybody for anything. But I think people should take responsibility and consider it. This is why I think what kind of bothered me about what the grandma that I was talking to said was it almost was like she was relieving herself of the potential responsibility of not having raised her kids properly, even though that's not at all what I was saying to her. I think, obviously, nothing can be said about my opinion of her kids. That's not even a thing I can make. And it would be totally unfair of me to do so. But maybe that's how she interpreted it. And maybe that's kind of what I was getting, is there was almost this desire to go to relieve responsibility from, if not herself, then her whole generation. And, I don't know. I think maybe we'd make a little bit more progress in the right direction if generational peoples could come, if that makes sense. People of their generation could come out and say, you know what, maybe we did make a mistake here, and here's how we can fix it. Here's what we see going wrong, and here's what maybe we can do to change that. But it seems like no one ever wants to take responsibility for their failures, or even if, maybe they did a good job. They can still look around and say, yeah, maybe we didn't, as a whole, do a good job. I truly believe that everybody has an impact on the society they live in. Everybody has an impact on their culture. And even if it's like, a half of a tenth of a thousandth of a percentage, you on average, you're going to meet 100 people. I think less. I think more. I think it's closer to 200. But let's just say 100 people. You are going to make either friends with, coworkers with, be family of, or make an impact on the lives of 200 people, or 100 people throughout your entire life. Now, if the same is true about those other 100 people, then what's 100 times 100? That's 10,000? Is that right? So that's 10,000 people, and then if any one of those 10,000 people have effects of 100, then that's 1,000,000. Wait, right? Oh my gosh, I can't do math in my head. So I think that's right. You're three generations, or you're 3 degrees of separation from 1,000,000 people having oh, you know what? I'm getting a very important phone call. I'm sorry. I'm going to go ahead and go. This is Kyle, rambling in a closet. Thank you very much for listening.